All right, good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the National World War II Museum. We really appreciate you joining us today for our regular Lunchbox lecture series. My name is Chrissy Gregg, and I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning here at the museum. I'm thrilled that my colleague, Maggie Hartley, who's the Director of Public Engagement, is actually, usually she's in this role, introing people, but today she's going to be in the spotlight, actually presenting today. Her lecture is entitled More Than Just Hemingway's Wife, The Wartime Journalism of Martha Gellhorn. Without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Maggie for her presentation. Thanks so much, Maggie.
Thanks for the introduction, Chrissy. It's definitely interesting being on the other side of this. I'm excited to do my first lecture here at the museum since joining the team. So, as many of you guys have figured out, this is about Martha Gellhorn. We're going to talk a little about Hemingway as well, because you can't talk about Martha Gellhorn in World War II without talking about the infamous Ernest Hemingway. And so one of the things that, I do want you guys to keep in mind is that, this whole perception of Martha, how did she get to where she did become a famous wartime correspondent? Was it based off of her work, her reporting in advance, or was it based off of her connections to Hemingway? Now, thinking about wartime correspondence, I do want to kind of fast forward a little bit to look at some more modern wartime correspondence. Now, when I think of female wartime correspondence, I go back to my youth. I know that's giving away my age a little bit. I think of Martha Raddatz and Lara Logan, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Those were two female faces, two of the only female faces that I remember. It's not quite as uncommon to see women on the fronts now. Even thinking to Ukraine, with everything that's going on right now, think about the faces you're seeing on TV. How often are they female? Just a quick pull. Lise Doucette from BBC, Clarissa Ward from CNN, Sabrina Travernise from the New York Times. There's not a lot of female faces still. It still is predominantly male. So when you talk about someone like Martha Gellhorn, her story is unique, and it's still unique today to be a prominent wartime correspondent during a major conflict. During World War II, there were about 100 registered war correspondents who were female, but none of them had the notoriety as Martha did. Now, her wartime career spanned from 1937 to 1989. She covered some incredible conflicts, not just World War II, the Spanish Civil War. She covered the Arab-Israeli conflict. She covered Vietnam. She also covered the different revolutions that were happening in Central and South America. And her stories were not just about the battle logistics. One of the things that made her unique was she looked at ordinary life. What was it like for the soldier? What was it like for the civilians? You'll hear later on during World War II, she focuses on the experience of teenagers in England in a few of her articles. And so she wrote stories not for ratings, but she wrote to show the different ways that war disrupts life. And during particular World War II, Times Magazine called Gellhorn one of Collier's star reporters. And, I think that can be true for the rest of her reporting as well. Her career spanned 60 years. Before she was a wartime correspondent, she covered the Great Depression. She covered different topics that were going on in Europe as well. She had quite an extraordinary career, but where did it begin? It started in her humble roots in Missouri. So she was born on November 8th, 1908, to George and Edna Gellhorn in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father was a German-born gynecologist, while her mother was a suffragist, an active supporter of women's rights. I think that's really what gave Martha her spunk and independence. And so at the age of 8, Martha participated in the Golden Line, which is pictured here on the screen. This was a rally for women's suffrage at the Democratic Party's 1916 National Convention in St. Louis. So you see women here. They're carrying yellow parasols, wearing yellow sashes. They were lined on both sides of the street heading towards the convention center at St. Louis Coliseum. there was a tableau of states in front of that building. States that had not yet enfranchised women were draped in black. One of the things that was unique about this is you mostly see adult women in this photo, but somewhere along these streets, there were two young girls that were designed to represent the future generations of female voters, and Martha was going to be one of them. So at a young age, she was very active, whether it was in politics, and particularly looking at women's suffrage, and later on looking at wartime and other, I don't want to spoil it quite yet, but during the Great Depression, she also becomes an advocate for other human rights type things. So she graduates high school in 1926 from John Burroughs School. It was a private prep school that was co-founded by her mother. And I think it's important to note her mother, I think, deserves a separate lecture as well. Her mother was an incredible woman, but unfortunately it has nothing to do with World War II, so you will not hear that from me here. Now, this slide kind of gives away this next portion of her life. She enrolls in Bryn Mawr for the class of 1930, but spoiler alert, she drops out within a year. Her goal is to become a foreign correspondent. She wants to be a journalist. So her first published works appear in the New Republic, and she gets a job in 1930 where she goes to France. She works for 2 years at the United Press Bureau in Paris. But she was fired after she reported sexual harassment that occurred for her from one of her coworkers. So some things hadn't changed. And so she spent her time then in Europe, traveling. She was determined to still be a foreign correspondent. She didn't want to give up on that dream. So she was writing for newspapers in Paris. She was writing for even newspapers in St. Louis as well. And incidentally, you think about, Martha Gellhorn, the great wartime correspondent. Well, she also had a side gig working for Vogue, covering fashion in Europe as well. So she was a very dynamic woman with lots of different abilities and skills. Her writing covers so many different topics. So I do think it's very interesting. Not many people think of fashion and think of Martha Gellhorn. It was during this time, too, that she became involved in the pacifist movement. And she wrote about these experiences in her book, What Mad Pursuit? Now, I will say I do think some of this starts to shift after the Great Depression, which we'll talk about right now. So in the early 1930s, she's over in Europe. She decides to come back to the United States, right as the Great Depression is hitting. It's during this time that she meets the Roosevelts. So Ernest Hemingway was not her only famous relationship. She actually became very good friends with Eleanor in particular in her early 20s, and despite the almost 30-year age gap, they had a lifelong friendship. Gellhorn would go on to describe Eleanor with this: she gave off light. No one seeing her could fail to be moved. So the Roosevelts often had Martha over at the White House pretty regularly, and eventually Martha moved in with them for a little bit. She spent her evenings with Eleanor working on her correspondence, and then also helping her with the First Lady's My Day column in the Women's Home Companion. And so it was through this relationship that Martha got another reporting job. This one would be as a field investigator for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. So she would then travel around the United States with Farah to report on how the Depression was affecting the country. Again, remember, she really is looking at these ordinary experiences. Ordinary people's experiences, how do devastating times impact them? So she first went to Gastonia, North Carolina, but then later she would travel with Dorothea Lange, a photographer, to document the everyday lives of the hungry and homeless. Their reports would eventually become part of the official government files for the Great Depression. And what was unique is they were able to investigate topics that were typically off limits to women during this time. Typically, this would be something that would be assigned to a man. And I think this really led the way for her to be a dynamic wartime correspondent as well. This was something she had experienced in, dealing with uncomfortable topics and sharing them in a very humane way. And she drew on this experience and research to write a collection of short stories in The Trouble I've Seen in 1936. Now, one quick story, Martha's not an ordinary woman. She's very independent. She was raised that way as well. And so when she was in Idaho doing Pharaoh work, she convinced a group of workers to break the windows of their office to draw attention to their crooked boss. And while this worked, she was also fired from FARA. That was the end of her reporting with them. After that, she was invited back to the White House to live with them for 2 more months, responding to mail. So she had a very interesting career up to this point, a very tenacious spirit, I should say. Now, it's 1936, and she meets Ernest Hemingway. Just by coincidence, her father had passed away and the family decided to take a Christmas vacation to Key West, Florida. And this would be something that would change her life forever. She befriended Ernest Hemingway at a bar called Sloppy Joe's. She would go on to meet his wife, Pauline, along with their 2 sons, and occasionally his son from his first marriage would come along as well. And they built this friendship up, and that's how she started learning a little bit more about what was going on in the Spanish Civil War. And eventually would pursue an opportunity to cover the Spanish Civil War with Collier's. And so, because Hemingway also took an assignment, let's not completely disregard the fact that her love interest was also involved in this. And so she did get assigned to cover the Spanish Civil War, and she traveled to Spain with just her duffel bag, some tin cans of food, and her last $50. And that's where she met up with Hemingway, and then they would go on to cover the war. This picture in particular, you can't quite see him. His back's in the bottom right corner, but it's one of them on the front lines. You know, she covered the stories of the bombings in Barcelona. That's also where they spent Christmas together in 1937. She covered the stories of soldiers in hospitals. That's something that she would go on to do at D-Day as well. And also, what was life like in the trenches on the front lines, as you see right here. She did spend a lot of time with the soldiers and with the people. It wasn't just standing back, reporting from a distance. So as we know, things in Europe start progressing pretty quickly in the late 1930s. Hitler begins taking over Europe, and she is actually present for the invasion of Czechoslovakia as well as the invasion of Finland. And one of the things, typically when I've done this presentation before, I don't usually read a clip from her time in Finland, but I will do a quick shout out. I was talking about this with one of the audience members just a little bit ago. All of her articles are in a book. She took all of her wartime articles, put them in this one book, The Face of War, and provides commentary looking back usually 2 decades later. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I was going back and just reviewing a little bit of this, and it struck me, this one paragraph in particular, looking back at the similarities to what she was observing in the early parts of World War II and to what we're seeing today. And so she said, "In Spain, I had understood the meaning of the war. I saw clearly what the Spanish War was for and what it was against. On the boat, going first to England, I was in on the beginning of a great war of greed started by a madman. It felt different. It felt unreal, yet obviously nothing about high explosive is unreal. But this war was a total madness. One criminal lunatic and his followers wanted what they could never get, domination over their time, and they grabbed for it. Other grabbers joined them, and the world slid into a 6-year-long dream of hell. The sense of the insanity and wickedness of this war grew in me until, for purposes of mental hygiene, I gave up trying to think or judge and turned myself into a walking tape recorder with eyes. The way people stay half sane in war, I imagine, is to suspend a large part of their reasoning minds, lose most of their sensitivity, laugh when they get the smallest chance, and go a bit, but increasingly crazy." I think that provides some insight into how she approached war, and how she was there to see these few moments of levity. She saw the pain, she saw the hurt right there in advance. She goes on in her article about Finland really to focus on the impacts of the bombings on the individual people, because this for them came out of nowhere. Now, we do have to go back to Hemingway for a little bit. Again, like I said at the beginning, we can't completely ignore his role in her life, particularly in World War II. Hemingway always wanted a wife. He always needed to have a wife with him to have this domestic life where he had the doting wife who took care of everything at home. I'm pretty sure you've picked up by now that that's not Martha Gellhorn. However, she was madly in love, very attracted to him, I think more so to his wartime reporting and his experiences than anything else. But she would go on to marry him in December of 1940, after he spent a few years trying to woo her as well to convince her that marriage was the way to go. They would then go on to buy a house in Cuba, as you see here on the left. She's standing. It's not the clearest photo, but it is a picture of her at Finca Vieja. They first rented it and then bought it. And while Hemingway was not allowing her to go report on the war, she spent her time renovating the home. She had to stay busy. And so she would preoccupy herself with these things while oftentimes he would be writing. This was during the time that he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls. He would spend his time writing, drinking daiquiris, or being on his fishing boat, the Pilar. He would eventually decide to get into the war effort with the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to hunt for German submarines on his fishing boat. That was not a successful thing at all. Now, in true Martha fashion, I will say she did get a few wins related to wartime reporting. And so I like to call 1941 her Asian honeymoon. She had received a job from Collier's to report on the Sino-Japanese-American War, and she had convinced Hemingway to come along with her. This is just after they had gotten married. And she would go on to write about this experience in her book, Travels with Myself and Another. This one's her memoir in particular. And one of the things that I find interesting about this is she doesn't refer to Hemingway by name in her reflections of her time on her honeymoon. She refers to him as UC throughout this chapter, which also means unwilling companion. He had no interest in going to China, made it extremely clear. But the ironic part of it is despite his lack of interest in going, he did accept a job during this time. He was actually asked by the United States Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau to gather intelligence on what was going on during the Sino-Japanese War. So he was gathering this intelligence, but more so the Treasury Department wasn't quite as interested in the war itself, but more so what was going on between nationalist and communist Chinese. They knew that long-term that was going to be the bigger issue than what was happening related to China and Japan. The Japanese would eventually leave, but what was happening internally would last much longer. And so this essentially their honeymoon trip was 100 days in Asia. They landed in Hong Kong, and then Martha would travel to Burma alone. She would go and see just, what exactly was going on. She would then meet back up with him in Hong Kong, where they visited the city's markets, opium dens, brothels, and would reported on the squalid social conditions that were endured by the Chinese immigrant population that was seeking refuge in Hong Kong as well. She would go on to say that the Chinese people surprised her. They accept calmly anything that happens: hunger, fatigue, cold, thirst, pain, or danger. And I think that sums it up pretty well, because then she had the firsthand experience of trying to get towards the fronts. They trudged through rain-soaked, muddy tracks on horseback. They traveled by crowded riverboat to get to the front, and she was appalled by the squalor and just unsanitary conditions that it took to get all the way up. She would describe the shoeless soldiers as having faces like orphan ghosts, and she actually ended up contracting what was called China rot. That doesn't sound like a really great condition, because it wasn't. It was a skin condition that was rather aggressive, like athlete's foot. And believe it or not, a lot of war correspondents in China ended up getting that as they made their way to the front. Again, you have these very muddy, very wet, unsanitary conditions as they're moving forward. They never saw action. The nationalists were very keen on making sure that both Martha and Hemingway didn't see exactly what was going on. They wanted to put a better image of themselves ahead. And so they would go on to meet with Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek on April 14th. This was the day after Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Japan. And she would go on to say during this conversation that Madam Chiang and Yusi were hitting it off all right, but she didn't quite have a good feeling about this conversation with them. She felt that a lot of what was happening was propaganda. She felt that it was very casual. She thought that they were so focused on their power and not on the people during this time. In comparison, she did meet with the Chinese communists as well. And what she would say about them was a little bit different. She wished that she had saved quotations to pass on to posterity, but she didn't remember a word. But she would go on and say that she thought the show was a winner. He was the one really good man that they had met in China. And if he was a sample of the Chinese communists, then the future was theirs. Interesting how she predicted that. Just in those conversations. It's very interesting to see how those dynamics played into what would happen after World War II. During their time in China, that's also when the U.S. ended all trade with Japan. Again, this is before Pearl Harbor, when they're over there. And so they're seeing really the impact of the Asian War before we become fully involved in it. Now, she doesn't just go to China during the wartime. Again, she's getting tired of staying at home. Hemingway's getting tired of hearing her complain that she's only hearing the news on the radio or in the newspapers and wants to be there. So he's finally like, fine, just go, just take a story, but come right back. So in 1943, she accompanies the 22nd Infantry to go scouting in Casino. Here's where she covered the story of orphans and the French fighting the Germans. She receives a letter during this time. Clearly, tensions are starting to get high. If he was an unwilling companion on their honeymoon, how is he going to feel 2 years later when she's over in Italy covering the war, getting a taste of everything that she wants? And so he finally asks her, "Are you a war correspondent or a wife in my bed?" And this sets the scene for the rest of the war for them. At this point, there's no more goodwill. It turns into a fight of who's going to win at this point. So England, 1944, she gets back to Cuba, decides she wants to take another assignment. She'd reached out to Collier's, and they had an assignment to go to England to get ready to cover a great invasion. Hemingway gets wind of this and actually steals her assignment and is so petty to block any and every way that she can try to get to England. So much so that she tried to get press passes to take a flight over that she eventually had to stow away in a ship filled with explosives to get over to Europe. That's definitely a high-stakes fight right there. During his time in England, he begins an affair with Mary Welsh, who is a Times Magazine correspondent, who later becomes his fourth and final wife. And I agree with you, he didn't learn. And I think something to note on that end, Hemingway wanted a wife. Martha wanted to be reporting the war. And so, it seemed like it was destined to never quite be there anyways. And so eventually she does get over through quite an interesting way. And she arrives to London, finds out that he's hospitalized. He had been in a car accident, had received a concussion, and she was called over to the hospital to come see him, finds out about the affair, and basically, unsympathetically, is like, I'm through, I'm absolutely finished. She's done. And at that point, she is determined to just do what she does best, cover the war. While in her time in England, she covered stories on pilots who had their experiences with their crashed planes or being pulled from burning wreckage. She was focusing on their scars and their experiences from a personal and sensitive point of view instead of just a ratings piece. This is also when she took the time to get to know teenagers. How are teenagers doing during the war? That's not something a lot of people did think about when you're looking at these news articles, but she took the time to do that. And she found that teenagers were resilient. Despite the terrible circumstances they were dealt, the absolute worst of times as they're coming of age, they still found joy in these moments. And they were doing what they could for the war effort, because even at a young age, they knew it was the right thing to do. And so that story would later be called Children Are Soldiers Too. Now, we're in England, it's 1944. We all know what's coming. The invasion of Normandy. It's inevitable, it's gonna happen. There's gonna be war correspondents assigned to this invasion. Hemingway, of course, gets the assignment. He stole the Collier's assignment, remember? So we're not gonna dwell on him at this point, but Helen Kirkpatrick was another female correspondent who was itching to get to cover the D-Day invasion. However, only men were selected to go, along with the troops on June 6th during those first few waves. She waited and hoped that she would eventually be selected, but it would take days for her to get over. If we have learned anything, Martha Gellhorn is not conventional. She takes things into her own hands, and she becomes the only known woman to land on the beaches at D-Day. Hemingway never got to the beach. There's stories that he kind of cowered in the back. I'm going to go with that. As you probably haven't figured out by now, I'm not Hemingway's biggest fan. And so here we go. It's the first hospital ship's the name of her article. And she details how she gets onto this hospital ship within this article. She gets wind of the invasion, rushes down to Southampton. She rushes to the waterfront and finds a hospital ship, a Norwegian hospital ship. She lies to the military police that she was supposed to go interview nurses and that she'd just get right back off and she wouldn't be on. We know better than that. Now, she ends up stowing away in a bathroom. Now, she did this. She knew the risk. She knows what could happen with this. She knows that she could lose her accreditation, she could be arrested, and she could be sent back to the United States. But however, she believed it was worth it to cover this great invasion. She knew this was going to be a major turning point in history, and she wanted to be a part of it. She goes on to write as they're going across the English Channel about how they watched two other hospital ships hit mines on their way over, and somehow theirs would be the first to arrive. They weren't supposed to be, but they were. They arrived near Omaha Beach, situated between Dog Red and Easy Red sectors. And as she's getting close, it's very interesting how she describes it. She describes it in a way I think that a lot of soldiers were thinking as they were coming across the channel, getting close to the beach. So bear with me a moment as I read her own words. Then we saw the coast of France, and suddenly we were in the midst of the armada of the invasion. People will be writing about this sight for 100 years, and whoever saw it will never forget. First, it seemed incredible. There could not be so many ships in the world. Then it seemed incredible as a feat of planning. If there were so many ships, what genius it required to get them here. What amazing and unimaginable genius. After the first shock of wonder and admiration, one began to look around and see separate details. There were destroyers and battleships and transports, a floating city of huge vessels anchored before the green cliffs of Normandy. Occasionally, you would see a gun flash, or perhaps only hear a distant roar as the naval guns fired over those hills. Small craft beetled around in a curiously jolly way. It looked like a lot of fun to race from shore to ships and snub-nosed boats beating up the spray. It was no fun at all. Considering the mines and obstacles that remained in the water, the sunken tanks with only their radio antenna showing above the water, the drowned bodies that still floated past. On an LCT near us, washing was hung up on a line. Between the loud explosions of mines being detonated on the beach, dance music could be heard coming from its radio. Barrage balloons, always looking like comic toy elephants, bounced high in the wind above the massed ships, and invisible planes droned behind the gray ceiling of cloud. Troops were unloading from big ships to heavy cement barges or to light craft, and on the shore, moving up 4 brown roads that scarred the hillside, our tanks clanked slowly and steady. Then we stopped noticing the invasion, the ships, the ominous beach, because the first wounded had arrived. It's amazing how she was able to capture the greatness of this invasion. She recognized, again, the significance of it, but was able to put it in a way that you understand its magnificence, but you also understand how devastating it was. Those little touches of humanity in this very bloody battle. So in true fashion, she ended up on the shore, as she was describing here. She was in a water ambulance, and she would wade to shore in waist-high water. And during that time, she found the urgency to get as many wounded men back to the ship as possible. She knew she was there to cover a story, but her humanity came out. She wanted to help. And so she was right there alongside of the medics, helping move men over to the beach. She was waiting alongside of them to take care of them until the water ambulance could come back and then take them to the ship. She sat alongside the wounded, waiting for them again, and she took note of the German bunkers. And particularly, as she's waiting, she's noticing these other acts of humanity, how the Americans had taped paths to guide others away from the mines, and those types of things, how people were looking out for each other. She eventually does get back to the ship, and she'll write a few things down, but then she gets back to taking care of the wounded. And so, let's see. She writes this about the wounded in particular. It will be hard to tell you of the wounded. There were so many of them. There was no time to talk. There was too much else to do. They had to be fed, as most of them had not eaten for 2 days. Shoes and clothing had to be cut off. They wanted water. The nurses and orderlies, working like demons, had to be found and called quickly to a bunk where a man suddenly and desperately needed attention. Plasma bottles must be watched. Cigarettes had to be lighted and held for those who could not use their hands. It seemed to take hours to pour hot coffee via the spout of a teapot into a mouth that just showed through bandages. But the wounded talked among themselves, and as time got on, we got to know them by their faces and their wounds, not by their names. They were a magnificent, enduring bunch of men who smiled, who were in such pain that all they really can have wanted to do was turn their heads away and cry, and men made jokes when they needed their strength just to survive. And all of them looked after each other, saying, "Give that boy a drink of water," or "Miss, see that ranger over there? He's in bad shape. Could you go to him first?" All of the shipmen were asking after other men by name, anxiously wondering if they were on board and how they were doing. She doesn't just capture battle logistics. She doesn't just look at statistics and things like that. She's looking at how is this impacting them. She goes on and writes about individual men that she got to know a little bit better as well during this time. And so by June 7th, they're back in England. What do you think happens at this point? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you, it's not going to be a happy ending. The risks, they came to be. She was immediately arrested as soon as she got back to England. She had her credentials stripped and was then transported to a nurse's training camp where she fully expected to be sent back to the United States. Somehow the military decided they wanted to still keep her in the war as a correspondent, but they put some conditions on it. They said that eventually they're going to ship more nurses over to Normandy. When they go over, she can go over. But that wasn't good enough for her. As you see with this quote here, she followed the war wherever she could reach it. She had been sent to Europe to do her job, which was not to report the rear areas or the woman's angle. So what she did was she found a ride with a British pilot who was flying to Italy and had no idea that she had been arrested. And so she caught a ride with him and would go on to cover many of the battles during the European theater. She would cover Market Garden. She would cover the Battle of the Bulge, and she would also be at Dachau. So May of 1945, she arrives at Dachau, and the article, a lot of her titles are a little bit more creative. The first hospital ship wasn't, but it seems that her most the poignant, the most heart-wrenching ones are the ones where she doesn't get as creative with those titles. And so she starts this one with a line about an American soldier who was talking to her as they were flying out of Germany. He said, "We got to talk about it. We got to talk about it, whether anyone believes us or not." She was one of the first journalists to cover this concentration camp. And again, I think that her own words say it better than what I could ever do. And she closes out this article reflecting on the fact that she was in Dachau the day that the Germans surrendered and the significance of being there on that date. And so she says, "I've not talked about how it was the day the American army arrived, though the prisoners told me. In their joy to be free and longing to see their friends who had come at last, many prisoners rushed to the fence and died electrocuted. There were those who died cheering because that effort of happiness was more than their bodies could endure. There were those who died because now they had food, and they ate before they could be stopped, and it killed them. I do not know words to describe the men who have survived this horror for years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and whose minds are as clear and unafraid as the day they entered. I was in Dachau when the German army surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The same half-naked skeleton who had been dug out of the death train shuffled back into the doctor's office. He said something in Polish. His voice was no stronger than a whisper. The Polish doctor clapped his hands gently and said, 'Bravo.' I asked what they were talking about. 'The war is over,' the doctor said. 'Germany is defeated.' We sat in that room, in that accursed cemetery prison, and no one had anything more to say. Still, Dachau seemed to me the most suitable place in Europe to hear the news of victory, for surely this war was made to abolish Dachau and all the other places like Dachau, and everything that Dachau stood for, and to abolish it forever." That's how she ends World War II. And again, you're seeing this humanity. You're seeing her compassion in her writing. And as we know, World War II is a very significant part of her time as a wartime correspondent, but she would go on and cover way more conflicts. I listed a few of them at the beginning. And what was interesting is, she breaks up with Hemingway right before D-Day. Doesn't really have time to settle things. And so I guess, I will comment a little bit on that. She decided, of course, not to return to Cuba. She didn't want to stay in London. She wanted to not do that. She wanted to stay in London and think of herself as someone new. She would later compare the war to a disease that causes pain beyond telling or imagining. And I think this would influence her writing as she would go on and choose to go to violent places and to serve as a war correspondent. One fun fact about Martha. Remember, she took the job in Italy during World War II, right as tensions started to grow between her and Hemingway. And she covered the story of war orphans. And she would actually go back and adopt one of them. And that would be her only child throughout the rest of her life. So she ended her career covering war by turning down the job to go to Bosnia in 1992. In the last years of her life, she was in frail health, she was nearly blind, and she was suffering from ovarian cancer that had spread to her liver. And on February 15th, 1998, she decided to take things into her own hands. She ended her life by suicide in London by swallowing a cyanide capsule. Now, after a lifetime of writing about war, and although the weapons and countries were different, she believed that most wars are the same through their consequences, through hunger, homelessness, fear, and pain. And as she came to the end of her career in 1988, she would write these words you see on the screen. There has to be a better way to run the world, and we had better see that we get it. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Maggie, for this wonderful presentation. I sure learned a lot about Martha Gellhorn. For those folks watching online, you can type in questions now on Facebook, either in the comments or on YouTube in the chat. I'm actually going to start with one before I pass it to y'all. Sorry about that. Someone trumped y'all on Facebook, but Frank was asking for her Correspondents at D-Day, did she win any awards or have any sort of recognition based on her very stellar work?
Unfortunately not, and it kind of goes back. This is something that still gets me. Hemingway, who never saw the actual battle himself, his article was published around the same time hers was, and that's the one that became famous. She never really received any acclaim for that. It would be later on, her legacy later on, that would get the recognition for it. But great question, sad answer, but great question.
Any questions in the crowd? Actually, I saw this gentleman first, and we'll pass the mic this way.
Thank you. I noticed a lot of the photographs were from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. I was wondering what is the connection between them?
So again, most of her photos from World War II were tied to Hemingway, and most of his photos, other writings, family belongings were donated to the Kennedy Presidential Library. It was a little bitter to be using most of his photographs for her to talk about her, but that's where most of them were. So.
Well, thank you, Maggie. A question: do you know the age difference between Hemingway and Martha? Was there a big stretch there?
I should know this. I know she would have been late 20s, early 30s, and considering that this was his third marriage, there would have been an age difference. I don't know quite the exact number at this point, but there's definitely an age difference there. I think that also played into things as well. He wanted to settle down. She wasn't ready to settle down. And I mean, to be honest, she never really settled down throughout her life. She would make London her home. But she would still go off and report war. That's not really the job of a dutiful housewife, so.
Thanks. Was she ever injured in the course of covering the war, other than the China rot?
Not anything significant from what I've seen, so.
I'm just checking the Facebook right now, make sure we covering folks there. This is a good one from Donna on Facebook. She was asking, how did she support herself, like financially, when she, said she used her last like $50, right, when she was going across the channel. So, do you have any more insight on that?
Well, she does get paid whenever she is working for Collier's. She didn't get paid for a D-Day article. Remember, that one was an independent journalist. She did eventually submit it somewhere where she did get some payment, but not like what she would have if she was assigned to the story. Her family did support her quite a bit early on in life, but you also have to remember she was married to Hemingway. He wasn't doing too bad either, especially during World War II. And she had good friends before she met Hemingway. She had the Roosevelts in her back pocket, and they took care of her as well. And so, I think it was a mix of family. I think it was a mix of, she was employed. She was employed by Collier's. She was receiving money, but I think it was also relationships that she had built too.
You're closest to me, so.
Do you know what Martha's reaction was to Hemingway's suicide?
I know she had one, and I don't think it was anything spectacular. I'll have to go back and look, but she does write about it at some point. But there's no real big emotion either way. I think with how things ended between them, she just wanted to be done. Again, she wanted to make herself something new. She didn't want to be tied to him anymore. I don't think she celebrated, but I also don't think she mourned. So.
Thank you. How did Martha get to know the Roosevelts?
That is one thing I'm not 100% certain on. I haven't found like that exact moment where they got to know each other. I know, it could have probably been something by chance. She was, of course, a reporter at that time. But that is definitely something that I would like to know more of as well. It kind of just, you see correspondences, you find out more information about her time in the White House, but that between coming back from France and moving in with the Roosevelts is a little unclear. Yeah.
Did she have any writings about her life in Cuba with Hemingway?
She, I want to say, doesn't really write as much about Cuba. That's not the life she wanted. Most of her writings, in particular, looking back on life, are related to her travels and to war. She didn't really see Cuba as a traveling destination. It was their home for a bit.
It was a 9-year age difference.
Oh, perfect.
What's the Imperial Museum and a lot of
Yep. The Imperial War Museum is the British War Museum. Yep.
her biography has reflections on her time in Cuba and her relationship with her. It's not much. She never dwells on it, but it's the most I've ever been able to.
Yeah, it's really just the biographies, again, like you said, that go into a little bit more detail there. And one thing I do want to note is our museum store does have a book that you may get a little bit more information on, particularly Hemingway and Gellhorn's relationship. We do sell one. It's by Janet Somerville. It's Yours for Probably Always, and it's their love letters from their relationship. So make sure you go check that out as well. I do also want to recommend her own words too. I found those the most useful in my research, but definitely thanks for that, and also go check out our store. Okay, so this one is The Face of War. This is all of her wartime articles from the Spanish Civil War to when she turns down the job for Bosnia. And this one is Travels with Myself and Another, and this is just travels throughout her whole life. This isn't just her time with Hemingway. She only really writes about him as UC, unwilling companion in the China Asian honeymoon, 100 Days of Wedded Bliss. But yeah, these are two books that she wrote. And so along with, so of course with the memoirs, reflections afterwards, but with The Face of War, she provides commentary looking back years later ahead of those articles too. So both are very fascinating.
All right, I think we'll take this as one final question.
Great presentation, thank you. Do you know what happened to her child?
I want to say he's alive. I don't know much more about that. She kept her private life private, and he seemed to have done the same. And so, but yeah, that's what I believe to be true. That could have changed since I really dug in. Really, the last time I did a deep dive into the research would have been 2020. So things could have changed in the last 2 years. But yeah, as far as I know from then, he was alive. So I believe in London as well.
All right. Well, Maggie, thank you so much for a great presentation today. Let's give Maggie a round of applause. This was a wonderful presentation for Women's History Month. And folks who are here, you know that this Lunchbox lecture series is a regular series, so please come visit us again if you're here in person. Obviously, for those folks online too, you can find out more information about our programs at nationalworldwar2museum.org. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Maggie.